Morning. Let's pray.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one.
Yesterday was the leave-taking of Theophany, and I want to propose that as we transition from talking about creation to talking about the fall, we do something very similar to what we did several months ago. If you recall, before we started talking about the fall, I said that, creation, that we start with John 1, not Genesis 1, when we start talking about creation. We start with Christ. We don't talk about creation as if Christ did not become incarnate, and try to understand the theology of creation and this biblical theology of what kind of world do we live in, what kind of creature are we, and only then later find, oh look, God enters that world and takes it to himself. That's backwards, all right? That's sort of the classical thing to do. You start with Genesis, you talk about creation, then you talk about the fall, then you talk about prophets calling people to repentance and everything, and then finally you get to the incarnation. But we start with the incarnation because it matters for our understanding of creation in the first place to know our belief that God enters into creation and takes it upon himself. Absolutely. Okay? In other words, God has a body. That matters to know what kind of creature are we, what were we made for, and we spent the whole fall really exploring that, not getting too bogged down, I hope, in the technical theology, but more in the sense of understanding that the human person was made to be filled with the life of God. The human person was made to know God and to be in communion through creation. Not in spite of creation, but through creation, we enter into communion with God. That the whole image of the Garden of Paradise is not this boring walking around, eating some things and having nothing else to do because everything's perfect and everything's fine. That sort of static notion of paradise, which we sometimes have perhaps in our minds, that in fact paradise was a beautiful civilization of worship. That paradise is the origin of all civilization. Civilization is not the consequence of human ingenuity as they gathered in farming communities. Civilization proceeds from the cult. It proceeds from the act of worship. And we've talked about this more last year, but how archaeology has backed this up, that predating by 1,000 years the advent of agriculture and animal husbandry, human persons that were considered to be hunter-gatherers at the time were building elaborate temple constructs in Mesopotamia, modern-day Turkey and northern Iraq. And we're finding these extraordinary complexes, and the dates the dates are confusing. How can this be? Well, that's because civilization comes from worship. And the story of paradise is the story of the original worship. And worship is this event of the God who is uncreated, who creates his people and meets them in paradise, who meets them in the temple, where the divine presence and the human presence are together. And that's really the whole creation story, but it also then leads us to the fall. Just as we started with the incarnation then to begin to look at creation, I want to propose that we do something while we're still relatively in the shadow of Theophany, and that is to say, let's look at Theophany to begin to understand the fall. Because like the incarnation, Theophany has all of these creation implications, all of these anthropological implications of who we are and what we're doing. And one of the biggest things I wanted to emphasize from this fall is that the mission of the human person to the rest of creation belongs to the state of creation itself. It's not a consequence of the fall. Mission proceeds from created reality. We are given a task, and we see in theophany the beginning of the renewal of that task, the renewal of the realization of that task. You've heard me say, I think before, it's somewhat unfortunate, but theophany is the second biggest feast of the church year, after Pascha alone, right? And you've probably heard me say this in introducing the services, some of the services that we did this year. Like Pascha and Nativity, theophany has a liturgical structure that parallels. The three of them parallel each other. They have royal hours on the eve of the feast. There's a vesperal liturgy with a bunch of Old Testament readings. Then there's a vigil and a festal then a festal liturgy the next day. And remember, if you will, I said that at Holy Saturday, the day before Pascha, we have the vesperal liturgy here, and we have 15 Old Testament readings. And these 15 Old Testament readings are the readings of the prophecy, really, of the resurrection of Christ, and our life restored in communion with God. In Nativity, which we also served the Vespers this year, despite the fact that Nativity was on a Sunday, so that sort of throws off the liturgical cycle a little bit. But at Nativity, there are 8 Old Testament readings at that vesperal liturgy, or Vespers if Nativity falls on a Sunday. At Theophanies, there's 13. So 15 for Pascha, 13 for Theophany, 8 for Nativity. They're all paralleling each other, but notice that they ramp up, right? Simply by the number of readings that we do. And that's an indication, okay? This is significant. This is huge. We're going to sit here and we're going to listen to all these readings, and we just want to just melt into them, if you will. This is the action of God. This is what God is doing when we listen to those readings. Theophany is hugely important, hugely important, because it's the beginning of the restoration of the beauty of creation itself, starting with the human person and the temple and moving out to all things. So what I thought we would do is we're just going to look rubrically at what do we actually do at Theophany, and then ask ourselves, what does that tell us about the fall and about the undoing of the fall? And I know that, like looking at the incarnation first and starting with Christ to understand creation, it might seem a little bit backwards. Don't we need to understand the theology of the fall before we can begin looking at this? What I want to contend is that we'll understand the theology of the fall and the reality of the fall much, much better if we begin to look at what Christ starts to do to undo the fall, okay? So rubrically, Theophany at the Vesperal Liturgy, which is usually the eve of the feast, the day before the feast. We have royal hours in the morning, and then usually right after royal hours or sometime in the early afternoon, there's what's called a Vesperal Liturgy. And a Vesperal Liturgy is when we take Vespers and we take liturgy and we combine them, and they meet at all those extra readings, those Old Testament readings. And the rubrics stipulate that at the Vesperal Liturgy, at the end of the liturgy, we come out and we do the great blessing of waters. Now, I know that doesn't accord with exactly our experience because we're used to blessing the water at the vigil the night of, all right, the night before the feast. So later on, we have Great Compline, we have Litia, and then we go right into the great blessing of waters. That's been our custom, and that's really the custom of many parishes because that's when most people are available and free to come to church and experience and witness the great blessing of water. But for our purposes, I'm simply pointing out that there's actually 2 blessings of water prescribed rubrically, and both of them are very helpful. Where they fall is in the liturgy, actually. We might not do it that way, but that's okay. Just bear with me for a moment. At the end of the liturgy, we come out and we have another, in a sense, it's a whole nother service with more readings and another gospel, and then we do the great blessing of water. And the prayer of the great blessing of water is very, very similar in structure and content to the blessing of the baptismal font water when we're about to baptize somebody, okay? So we do that. We bless water. We'll come back to that. Why do we bless water, and what's the whole imagery going on there? That'll become, I think, clear as we begin to talk. But and of course we know that. But just moving on, there's an interesting rubric then in the rubrics books about what do we do then? What do we do after we've blessed the water? The first thing we do is we walk around according to the rubrics and we bless the temple. Okay, so the temple's already blessed. Right? It's not like this hasn't been consecrated. It's been blessed. It's been consecrated. Holy water was thrown around here when we first came here. It was anointed with oil in various parts. We've done all that. But every year, nevertheless, the first thing we do after we've blessed the water is we take that water and we go around and we bless the whole temple. In a sense, we're renewing something that's already been done, but we're doing that annually. Then the rubrics say that the people come forward and they take a cup and they drink the water and they have the water splashed on them by the priest. Okay? We know that experience as well. Then the rubric says, we then process out of the church and leave to bless the homes of the people. Now we have to do a little bit of an imaginative leap here. Imagine we don't live in an era of automobiles. Imagine we live in a village where everyone lives around the church and they can all walk to the church. What this rubric has in mind is that once you've blessed the temple and once the people have been blessed, you then walk outside and you go house to house, business to business, schools, any other government buildings that are right around you, and you're in a procession. You still have your altar servers, you've got your choir walking, you've got cantors, you've got your deacons, and you've got your clergy, and we're out there, and we've got probably the censer is going, and we've got the holy water, and the parishioners are rushing ahead to their homes to open them up so that as this procession comes up their street, the whole procession can go through their home and bless their home with holy water. So this is a communal event, okay? It's really, rubrically, this is my point, is this a communal event? Now we have automobiles, so we do one at a time, and we drive half an hour in between everyone's home. Kind of, it's not quite the same. It's still nice. It's really a beautiful thing to do, and we love doing it. But the rubrical thing is a communal event. And what I want to point out to us is what we're doing there. We're blessing the temple where we meet God first with holy water. Then we're drinking holy water. And what is the human body? Also a temple, right? So we're blessing the temple of the human body. We're cleansing the temple of the human body. And then we're immediately going out and we're blessing another kind of temple. We're blessing your home. We're blessing where you live and where you eat and where you pray and where you sleep and where you be as a family. All right? So this is very interesting because what I said about paradise, and as we think about this with the fall, paradise is the temple. Paradise is a temple construct. It's a garden, yes, but it's gardens surrounding the central temple where the human person goes to meet God. It's the heavenly temple, you see. It's the heavenly temple. That heavenly temple never went away. It was closed off to us, but it never went away. It was where we met with God. After the fall, we've got a compromised relationship to the temple. So in theophany, one of the interesting things as we begin to see Christ's public ministry begin and Christ begin to act is what's the first thing that we bless? We bless the temples, plural. The temple of the church, which is the earthly manifestation of the heavenly temple, the temple of the body, which is also the temple of God's dwelling place, the heart, and the temple of the home. The home should be understood as a temple, as a holy abode. That's why we put an icon corner up. That's why we light candles. That's where we pray. We have a whole prayer life that occurs in the home that parallels our prayer life when we gather here in this temple, right? So there's a parallelism there. And we're blessing all of these temples all in the same go, right? All related to the same service, that Vesperal liturgy with the 13 Old Testament readings. Christ is now beginning to cleanse what we messed up, okay? What we messed up. So have that in mind as well, okay? Now there's a second blessing of great water, or second great blessing of water. Water is great, but there's a second blessing of water. That blessing of water is prescribed rubrically to occur at the festal liturgy. So at the end of the festal liturgy, this year Theophany was on a Friday. So Friday morning we had liturgy. At the end of liturgy we'd come out. We just blessed the water the day before, right? But we're going to do the exact same thing according to the rubrics the day after. Only this time we're going to do something a little bit different. This time we're going to go in a procession again. We got our choir, we got our altar servers, we got all the people. We're going to leave the church and we're going to go to the nearest natural body of water closest to the temple. That could be a river, it could be a lake, it could be a large stream, it could be the ocean, preferably living water, and by living water in the ancient world, that means running water, flowing water. We want this water to go and connect with other waters. But any water really will do, any water that's out there. Now there is, just for our reference, there's a tiny little creek across the street. And I'm not suggesting we do this, that our tiny little creek. I mean, it's like a drainage ditch almost. I don't know. If you go further down Thompson Run, it actually widens out and becomes a quite lovely little creek. But the idea is you go to the nearest body of water, and you do the exact same blessing of water that you did in the church, in the baptismal font, you do in the natural body of water. The priest is going to take the cross. He's still going to dip the cross into the water. In some traditions, they actually throw the cross into the water after having blessed it 3 times. And there's a tradition, even though it's in January, of jumping in the water, and those who are hardy and hale wanting to get into 35-degree water and go chase the cross. Or in many in Russia and Ukraine, it's very much the tradition. After the water has been blessed, you all seen this, they cut a hole in the ice, usually in the shape of a cross, and they put a lattice work down into there, and you can walk down into the water and bathe. And it's almost like, if you watch people do this on YouTube, it's like they're being baptized, but they're baptizing themselves. They're renewing their baptism. What's key here, though, is, and here's the connection I want to make. What's key here is to understand that we've blessed water for the temple, for the body, which is a temple, for the home, and we drink that water. We bless natural water, probably not going to drink it in most parts of the world. Don't recommend that we go drink like the Ohio River if we went down to the Ohio River. We're not going to drink that water. But what we're doing is, after having blessed the temples, now we're blessing all of creation. And this order is important. It is first the temple and the temples that are blessed, and then that blessing spreads as the feast amplifies, and we get to the festal divine liturgy, and it moves out of the bounds of our temple and the homes of the walls of our home. We go out into nature itself, and we begin to restore the order and the mission that was ours from the beginning, from before the fall. What is that mission? To take paradise, which is a temple, and to spread it. That's the mission. To make the world the paradise of communion with God. That is what we were called to do even before we fell. Christ begins to undo what we did and begins to complete what we failed to do when he is baptized in the waters of the Jordan. He makes all things pure. And there's this wonderful understanding that when we bless water, and of course water is all interconnected, water blesses water, right? If we go down to the point it really strikes me where we really need to have a blessing is right down at the point. The Sunday after Theophany, get a bunch of parishes together, we meet downtown, we process from the city where we parked out into the point and bless the three rivers right there. Can't jump in there. It's the current is really dangerous. But it would be a beautiful, beautiful thing. And what a symbolic thing to do. One of the chief sort of symbolic beauties of Pittsburgh is three rivers coming together and connecting and then moving west. Well, that's the whole idea of Theophany, blessing of waters, the natural waters. We bless water, and because water is connected to the water, it spreads outwards. If I shared with you this, this is sort of an aside. A lot of times when we bring our bottles of water to church and we fill them with water, and we go over to the holy water font, which is over in the corner now, so you can still do that. It's still full. And we fill it all the way up. We got an empty bottom. We fill it all the way up. I was really surprised when I was in Texas. We had a family from Aleppo, Syria. Their family had been Christian for millennia. And he comes up to get holy water, and he's got two full, brand new bottles of drinking water that he stopped at the gas station on the way to church, and he just bought them, and there's water in them. Have I told this story? Some of you haven't been here before, so or haven't been to the class. So I was confused. I'm like, Shafiq, we already blessed the water. We don't need water. We bless the water. Like, you need an empty container, You don't, what are you doing with that water? He made me nervous because I didn't know what he was doing. He was about to go do something. And he has all this water. He goes, no, Father, watch. And he takes the lid off the water, and he goes to the holy water, the holy water thing, and he puts a drop in. And then he puts the lid back on. He's like, now it's all holy. And that's the way they do it. And if you think about that on a purely practical level, well, first of all, sacramentally, that's correct. Holy water blesses the water in which it comes into contact, right? So if you have a thing of water and you just add a little bit of holy water to it, the whole thing becomes holy. And this is I think this tends to be more of like the Greek Antiochian practice, but I also think that it has a wonderful practical consideration. Imagine if a lot of our Greek and Antiochian parishes, they've got like 1,000 families. Can you imagine how much holy water you would need to consecrate if every family came with like a big water bottle and filled it from empty to full, and you couldn't add water to the holy water to replenish it? That would be a logistical nightmare. You'd need to have a priest whose only job was to bless holy water for a month, So there's actually a practical element of it, but it's a wonderful image, too, of the nature of how grace and blessing spreads and moves. When we drink a little bit of holy water, that holy water connects to all the water that makes up our bodies and purifies us and sanctifies us in a beautiful, beautiful way. Of course, it can't do that anywhere close to what the divine Eucharist does. When we receive the holy mystery of Christ's body and blood, of course, it's the same thing. Our very substance is leavened. Leaven is yeast, this little creature that we put in flour, water, and salt that spreads and causes it to rise. The Eucharist is the leaven, and a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump, is the biblical statement, right? We take a small amount, but it changes everything about us. So what's the significance of this? Well, if we get back to the blessing of water itself, you'll notice that water is associated with the presence of spiritual evil. When we bless the water at the great blessing of waters, when we bless the water of baptism, we first exorcise it. We cast out the spiritual presence of evil. Water is a favored medium for fallen spiritual powers. The air is another one. Rock, not so much. But water and air are favored mediums of inhabitation of dark spiritual powers. When we bless water, we are actually engaging in an act of reclaiming it for the kingdom of God and kicking out any foreign or alien spirits that have taken up their abode in that place. All right? This is very, very clear. And when we look at the whole story of the baptism of Christ, theophany, and then what happens right after that, and then we start thinking about this in relation to the fall, how does this relate to the fall? Notice what we have. As soon as Christ is baptized, and if you look at the icon of his baptism, there's always these little figures down in the water. You notice that? Look in the river Jordan, the water part, and there's all these figures. And in some icons, those figures are the sort of the spiritual powers that are being expelled as Christ receives baptism and sanctifies the whole of material created reality once again. But when Christ comes up out of the water, he is driven by the Spirit into the wilderness, and who meets him out there? Satan. You know, it's very explicit. Satan meets him in the wilderness. That's the other place that the evil spirits love. They love water, they love air. We call them sometimes the aerial spirits, and they love the desert. They love the wilderness. We talked a little bit about transcendentalism in the fall, and our American romanticism of nature and connecting with nature and just being out in nature and everything. In the ancient world, however, the wilderness and the desert was understood to be the place where the spirits dwelt, not the good spirits, the bad spirits. And so Christ goes into the wilderness to do battle. And he does battle with the figure of Satan, who tempts him 3 times and fails at each one. And the Holy Fathers are very clear that this threefold temptation of Christ in the desert parallels the temptation of Adam and Eve in the garden. All right? It's a reverse parallelism. And I know you've heard me preach about this before, or some of you have and some of you haven't, but what's remarkable about it, you've got Adam and Eve in a garden of paradise where there's food everywhere. You've got Christ in a desert who fasts. He fasts for 40 days and he's hungry. And the first temptation is food, right? For Adam and Eve, take this fruit that God said don't eat. You will be like God. Eat of it. They have all this other food. And food is meant, we'll talk about this a little bit more next week as we get deeper into this. Food is ultimately this remarkable substance. We need it to physically live. But food is also always an act of communion. All food is an act of communion. The food of the garden is life welling up from the ground, life expressing itself through living things and then being offered to God in a priestly act and then consumed with an understanding that when we eat food with God, we are in communion with God. The same thing with ourselves. When we sit down at the dinner table, Christmas dinner, Thanksgiving dinner, we eat food together, we commune. It's an act of community, and that's what the word community means. We're becoming one with each other. Eating is an intimate act of relationship, right? So they've got all this food, but don't eat this one thing, and we'll talk about that later, why not that one thing. And the serpent says, no, I want you to eat it, and they do. Christ has not eaten for 40 days. He's in a desert where there's no food, and he is tempted to turn this stone into bread. Why should you be hungry? And Christ resists. Christ says, no, man shall not live by bread alone, but by everything that comes from God. So there's the opposite, right? Garden to desert, abundance of food, everything taken care of for you, absolute deprivation, hunger and thirst and cold, and this presence of evil. And this presence of evil is what's being cast out in theophany. And it's the connection between theophany and the blessing of natural water and the restoration of creation itself. First the temples, again in the plural, and then creation. The restoration is based on the casting out of an alien spirit, a presence that does not belong there. And it's really important then to see that if that's the first thing that happens, if that's the first thing that Christ begins to do in his own baptism, as he purifies the water of the spirits that dwelt there, and then goes out into the desert and undoes the disobedience of Adam, then that point of contention, that point of contest with spiritual evil probably ought to be the place where we begin to start talking about the fall itself. Not the fall as human psychology, the fall as a metaphor for, this kind of knowledge or that kind of knowledge or other kinds of human experience, but the fall as a meeting point between the human person and a spiritual evil that wants to drag that person down, that wants to receive worship from the human person, that wants to defile the human person, right? So theophany is the beginning of casting that demon, casting that spirit out of the water, out of our bodies. Of course, baptism does this, but theophany, the blessing of theophany, is a renewal of baptism, just as confession is a renewal of baptism. There's a connection there, you see, as well. Confession is where we cleanse the inside. We can hide the outside. We can make ourselves look perfectly respectable, but we can't hide the inside from anybody, really. No, well, we can hide it from each other, but we can't hide it from God, and we can't hide it from ourselves, hopefully. If we can hide it from ourselves, then we're in real trouble. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, that's a great example. Yeah, wonderful question. So for our home audience here, what does it say if evil lurks in the waters? Then what does that say about the baptism of John? John's baptism before Christ has sanctified the water through his baptism. John's baptism is part of a whole continuum of the use of water for purification rites in the temple. So what happens, I think, one way of thinking about this is that there is temporary actions that can be taken before the baptism of Christ. And by the way, the baptism of Christ sanctifies the waters, but notice we keep sanctifying the waters, right? We don't say, oh, that was done once 2,000 years ago, so we don't need to bless the waters anymore. We need to keep blessing the waters. Part of the answer to this question is, why do we need to keep blessing water if we've already blessed it? Doesn't it stay blessed? Well, the reality is the battle is still going. Spiritual evil has been cast out, but it's still lurking. Its power has been very diminished. And that's why we don't see its power as readily in the modern world as they did in the ancient world. And it's because of the spread of Christianity. It's because of the spread of sanctification. Every year we sanctify, Orthodox Christians around the globe sanctify the natural waters, but then we do it again the next year because the battle's still going. So when we look at something like the temple or Jewish mikvah, that's a bath that you take to purify your body before you make an offering in the temple. Is there necessarily a presence of spiritual evil in that water? Well, there could be, but there would have been prayers of consecration for that water as well. So the short answer here is, with John's baptism, John is baptizing the Jordan, and John is acting as a prophet to sanctify the water for that purpose. So he's not conveying a spiritual presence of evil to those who are receiving his baptism. That would be actually kind of blasphemous. But it's a great question because it really raises the whole dynamic of we keep blessing water. We only baptize you once, but you keep drinking holy water throughout your life, right? We keep communing in the body and blood of Christ. We keep praying. We keep confessing. We continue because this is the mission. This is the journey. And the battle still wages, and God has already won it. God is the victor, and the enemy was never the equal opposite of God, right? The enemy really never had the power that he desired. But the contest is still there, and for our sakes, we have to be watchful and vigilant always regarding the reality of spiritual evil, which manifests itself in subtle ways. And we're going to talk about that as we go through this sort of section all the way through Pascha. We're talking about the fall. We are going to talk about the spiritual warfare. How does spiritual evil impact our lives? How does it manifest in our lives? Especially in the scientific worldview, in the scientific era, where we tend to interpret things a certain way and not see other things. And there's a reason for that as well. So yeah, the short answer, temporary blessings of water. We've certainly been part of the whole background there. All right, we need to stop there, but we'll pick this up again next week, and we'll talk a little bit more. This was sort of an introduction to the spiritual contest. We're going to talk a little bit more about the three temptations of Christ in the desert and how that corresponds to the fall of Adam and Eve in paradise, and then look more specifically about that fall and its consequences.